The drive up to the cabin took longer than I expected. The roads were winding, twisting through the thick forest, and the deeper I went, the less I saw of civilization. No gas stations, no streetlights, just trees swallowing the narrow road. The sun was already sinking behind the hills when I finally reached the clearing where the cabin sat. It was a simple structure. Wooden walls, a slanted roof, and a small front porch. Nothing fancy. It had been a rental, some online listing that promised peace, quiet, and a break from city life. I wanted solitude, time to clear my head, and this seemed perfect. No neighbors, no distractions. Just me, the trees, and the sound of the wind. Inside, the cabin was basic. A single bed against the far wall, a small kitchen with an old stove, and a fireplace that smelled of burnt wood. There was a table with 2 chairs, a couch that had definitely seen better days, and a single window facing the forest.
No TV, no Wi-Fi.
Just silence. I liked that at first. I unpacked, made myself a simple meal, and settled in for the night. The wind outside was steady, making the trees creak and groan. There was something unsettling about the quiet, about how absolute it was. No cars, no distant hum of the city, just the occasional rustling of leaves. The first night passed without much incident, except for a few noises outside. Could have been an animal. I told myself that over and over. Just a deer, a raccoon, nothing unusual. But still, I double-checked the locks before heading to bed. The second day, I decided to explore. The forest was dense. The trees packed so closely together that they swallowed most of the sunlight. I walked for a couple of hours, following a rough trail that eventually led to a small, stagnant pond. The water was dark, almost black. I didn't stay there long. Something about it felt off. Heading back, I noticed something strange. The path I had taken looked different, as if it had shifted. I stopped, turned in a slow circle, trying to retrace my steps. My stomach tightened. I wasn't lost, but I felt misplaced. I forced myself to move, to keep walking, and eventually, I found the clearing where the cabin stood. Relief washed over me. Maybe I had overthought it. Maybe my mind was playing tricks. That night, the noises outside grew louder. More movement, heavier. Not just an animal. Something walking, something big. My stomach knotted up as I sat in the dark, listening. Footsteps circled the cabin, slow, deliberate. I held my breath. My heart pounded. Then silence. I barely slept. Morning couldn't come fast enough. When the sun finally rose, I stepped outside, expecting to see tracks in the dirt. But there was nothing.
No footprints.
No broken branches, just undisturbed ground. I tried to shake the unease, but it clung to me. The day passed in a haze. I read, I cooked, but I couldn't focus. My mind kept drifting back to the night before. What had I heard? Was I imagining things? I kept glancing toward the tree line, expecting movement. The woods felt different now, like they were watching me. That night, the noises returned. Louder this time, closer. The footsteps stopped just outside the front door. I sat frozen, every muscle in my body tense. Then knock, knock, knock. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. My mind screamed at me to do something, but I couldn't. I just sat there, gripping the armrest of the couch so hard my knuckles ached. Then silence again.
No retreating footsteps.
Nothing. I stayed awake until dawn, every sound making my skin crawl. When light finally spilled through the window, I forced myself to open the door. My hands shook. The porch was empty.
No footprints.
No sign that anyone had been there. I needed to leave. The idea of spending another night here made my stomach churn. I packed quickly, shoving my things into my bag. But as I reached for my keys, I realized something that made my blood run cold. They weren't there. I searched everywhere. The table, the kitchen, under the bed. They were gone. I hadn't left them outside. I knew I hadn't, but they were nowhere to be found. Panic set in. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. I knew I had service when I arrived. Now, nothing. Like the world had cut me off. I had to get out. I wasn't gonna sit there and wait for another night. I grabbed my bag and stepped outside. The forest stretched out in every direction, the road barely visible through the trees. I started walking, fast at first, then faster. I followed the road, heart hammering, every rustling leaf making my nerves fray. I walked for what felt like hours, but the road didn't seem to end. Felt wrong, like I wasn't getting anywhere. Then I saw it. The cabin, right in front of me. I stopped, my breath caught in my throat. My brain couldn't process it. I had walked straight, followed the road, but I was right back where I started. I turned, started walking again. I didn't stop, didn't slow down, but no matter which way I went, I kept ending up in the same place. The same clearing, the same damn cabin. The sun started setting. My legs ached. My throat was dry. I had no choice. I had to go back inside. The door creaked as I pushed it open. The air inside felt heavy, suffocating. I set my bag down and collapsed onto the couch, my body shaking from exhaustion. I don't know when I fell asleep, but when I woke up, the room was dark. The air was different, stale, heavy, like something else was inside with me. Then the knocking started again. Knock, knock, knock. And I knew this time the door wouldn't hold. I should have never gone up there alone. It started with the idea of a quiet weekend. No people, no noise, just me, the trees, and a dusty old cabin that belonged to my uncle. He hadn't used it in years, and since I'd been working myself to death in the city, I figured some time in the woods would do me good. No reception, no distractions, just solitude. The drive was long, cutting through winding roads where the trees pressed in from both sides, their bare branches scraping the sky. It was mid-November, and most of the leaves had already fallen, leaving everything looking skeletal and cold. I didn't see another car for miles. The further I went, the more alone I felt. The idea was appealing at first. I arrived in the late afternoon. The cabin sat in a small clearing, an old, one-story thing with a slanted roof and a front porch sagging in the middle. The windows were dark, the door slightly warped from age. My uncle had warned me that the place was in rough shape, but it was worse than I expected. The wood had turned gray, and some of the planks on the porch were split. The whole place smelled like damp earth and rotting leaves. I parked the truck and grabbed my bags. The air was sharp with the kind of cold that clung to your skin. The key was exactly where my uncle said it would be, under a loose stone near the steps. The door groaned when I pushed it open, and inside, it was even colder. The cabin had a single main room with a fireplace on one side, a small kitchen in the back, and a door leading to a tiny bedroom. Dust covered everything. The furniture was old, the kind you'd expect to see in a place abandoned for years. A wooden table, 2 chairs, a couch that smelled like mildew, and a rug so worn it was barely holding together. I set my bag down and checked the fireplace. The wood pile outside was still dry, so I got a fire going. It took a while, but eventually, warmth started creeping into the room. I didn't bother with the bedroom. I wasn't planning on staying long enough to care. The first night was fine. The silence was thick, pressing against the cabin like a heavy blanket. The fire crackled, and the wind moved through the trees outside. I sat in an old chair, listening, watching the shadows stretch across the walls. I should have left in the morning. I woke up to find the door open. Not wide open, just cracked enough to let in the cold. My first thought was that I hadn't latched it properly, that maybe the wind had pushed it open. But when I walked over, I saw something in the dirt outside, faint, almost erased by the night's frost. Footprints, not boot prints, not animal tracks, bare feet. I stared at them for a long time, my mind trying to make sense of it. They led from the tree line to the porch, then stopped at the door. They didn't go back. I shut the door, locked it, and moved one of the chairs in front of it. I told myself I was being paranoid, that maybe I was imagining things. The wind howled outside, and I tried to convince myself that nothing was wrong. By afternoon, I felt stupid for worrying. The prints could have been old. Maybe I just hadn't noticed them when I arrived. I spent the day chopping wood, checking the generator, and making sure the place wouldn't fall apart around me. That night, I locked the door again, double-checked it. I woke up to the sound of something moving outside. Not the wind, not an animal, something deliberate. I didn't move at first, just listened. The fire had burned low, and the room was filled with shifting shadows. I heard footsteps, slow, careful, right outside the cabin. Then silence. I sat there for what felt like hours, waiting for something to happen. When morning came, I finally forced myself to move. I checked outside. More footprints, closer this time, right up against the cabin wall. I packed my bag. The drive back should have been simple. It wasn't. Halfway down the road, my truck stalled, just died, right in the middle of nowhere. I checked under the hood, but I'm no mechanic. I couldn't see anything wrong, but the damn thing wouldn't start. I tried my phone. No service. Of course, I didn't have many options. The closest town was miles away, and I wasn't about to sit in my truck all night. I grabbed my bag and started walking. The woods were silent, too silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of my boots on the dirt road. Every now and then, I thought I heard something behind me, twigs snapping, leaves crunching. I told myself it was just my imagination. It wasn't. As the sun started to set, I saw movement between the trees, a shape shifting just out of sight. I stopped. I didn't run. Running felt like the wrong move. Instead, I kept walking, faster now, my heart pounding. The shape moved again, keeping pace. I couldn't see it clearly, but I knew it was there. The road curved, and up ahead, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Footprints, bare feet, leading toward me. I turned around, walked faster. The sky darkened. The trees stretched taller. The air was heavy, pressing against me. I walked until my legs ached, until my breath came in sharp gasps. I didn't stop, not until I saw headlights in the distance. A truck, old, rusted, a man in the driver's seat. He looked at me like I was crazy when I waved him down, but he let me in. I didn't tell him everything, just that my truck broke down, that I needed a ride to town. I didn't look back, not once. I got a tow the next day. My truck was fine, started on the first try. I never went back to that cabin. My uncle asked me about it once, if everything was okay up there. I told him it was fine, just needed some repairs. I still dream about it sometimes. The footprints, the silence, the shape moving in the trees. I don't go anywhere alone anymore. I never wanted to go to that cabin in the first place. It was my brother's idea. He swore he found a great deal on a secluded rental up in the mountains, perfect for some quiet, some fresh air, and, as he put it, resetting our minds. I wasn't in the mood for a trip, especially not one that involved isolation. But he kept pushing, saying I'd been working too hard, that I needed to disconnect, so I gave in. Looking back now, I wish I hadn't. The drive was longer than I expected. My brother had bailed last minute, citing work obligations, which left me alone with the reservation. I thought about canceling, but I'd already paid. The road leading up to the cabin was rough, barely more than a dirt path cutting through the thick forest. The trees pressed in on both sides, and the only sound was the occasional crunch of gravel beneath my tires. The deeper I went, the more I regretted this decision. The cabin itself was old, not in a charming way, but in a way that suggested neglect. The wooden steps leading to the porch creaked under my weight. The lock was stiff, and the key fought me before finally turning with a loud click. The air inside was thick, stale, carrying the scent of damp wood and something else I couldn't quite place. The living room was sparse, just a sagging couch, a scratched-up coffee table, and a fireplace filled with old ash. A single window faced the trees, but they were so dense that the light barely made it inside. The first night was uneventful, though I never quite shook the feeling of being watched. I chalked it up to being alone in an unfamiliar place. The woods outside were loud, filled with the chirping of insects and the occasional rustling of leaves. I told myself it was just animals, but my nerves didn't settle. Every so often, I thought I heard something else. A snap of a branch that sounded too deliberate, too heavy for a small animal. The next day, I explored the area a bit, hiking down the overgrown trails behind the cabin. The trees were dense, the forest floor thick with fallen leaves and damp earth. After about an hour, I found a small clearing with a pile of stones stacked oddly, almost ritualistic in shape. It unsettled me, so I turned back. The trail looked different on the way back, though. I knew I had followed a straight path, but I found myself disoriented. The trees all looked the same, and I could no longer hear the distant hum of the cabin's wind chimes. My heart pounded. Took me longer than it should have to find my way back. That night, the sounds outside the cabin changed. There was something moving in the woods, something bigger than a deer. I told myself it was just my nerves again, but then I heard it, slow, deliberate footsteps. Not the erratic movements of an animal, but something moving with purpose. I sat frozen in the dark, listening. The footsteps circled the cabin once, then stopped. I held my breath, ears straining. Nothing. Minutes passed, then hours. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a restless sleep. The next morning, I checked outside, half expecting to find tracks. The ground was disturbed near the edge of the treeline, but not in any way I could make sense of. The dirt looked dragged, like something heavy had been pulled through it. I tried to convince myself it was a fallen branch or maybe an animal, but deep down I knew better. I thought about leaving then, but I hated the idea of running from something I couldn't even explain. Instead, I stayed, trying to rationalize everything, but the feeling of unease never left. That night, it got worse. The footsteps came again. This time, they stopped at the porch. I heard the wood groan under the weight of something standing just outside the door. I held my breath. The handle rattled. My body went rigid. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't my imagination. Someone was outside trying to get in. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Silence stretched on, long and suffocating. I stayed up the rest of the night, clutching the only weapon I had, a rusty fireplace poker. By morning, I'd made up my mind. I was leaving. I grabbed my bag, not even bothering to pack properly, and threw open the door. My stomach dropped. There were footprints in the dirt, leading from the woods to my porch. Large prints, human prints. But the thing that sent a shiver through me was that there were no prints leading away. Whoever had been there never left. I didn't think. I just ran to my car, threw my bag in the passenger seat, and started the engine. As I backed up, my eyes flicked to the cabin one last time. Something in the window moved. A shadow, a shape, watching me. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I drove until my gas light came on, not caring where I ended up. When I finally pulled into a gas station hours later, my hands were still shaking. I never told my brother what happened. Never told anyone. I just deleted the listing from my email and pretended the trip never happened. But sometimes, late at night, I think about those footprints. I think about the way the woods felt wrong, the way something had been watching me. And I wonder, if I had stayed just one more night, would I have made it out at all? I never wanted to buy the cabin. It was my brother's idea. He found the listing online, and the pictures made it look decent enough. A small wooden place out in the middle of nowhere, nestled between thick pine trees. It was cheap too because the owner had been trying to get rid of it for years. I should have thought more about why. I don't know why I agreed to go there alone. My brother was supposed to come, but at the last minute he bailed on me. Just check it out, he told me over the phone. Make sure it's not falling apart or full of raccoons. He laughed, but I didn't. The drive was long, and as I left the main road and turned onto the dirt path leading to the cabin, I started feeling uneasy. The trees were too thick, the road too narrow. It felt like I was going somewhere I wasn't supposed to be. By the time I got there, it was already late afternoon. The place was smaller than I expected, with dark wooden walls and a roof covered in dead leaves. The porch creaked when I stepped onto it. The key the owner had mailed to my brother worked, but I had to shove the door hard to get it open. Inside, the air was stale, carrying that scent of wood and something else. Something faint, almost like damp earth. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. No birds, no wind through the trees. Just silence. The inside of the cabin was plain. A kitchen with an old stove and a small fridge. A living area with a couch that had definitely seen better days, and a fireplace that was probably the only source of heat. There was a single bedroom in the back and a bathroom that had a weird smell I couldn't place. The kind of smell that sits in your throat, like mold but different. I set my bag down and started checking the place out. The floors creaked with every step, and I found scratches in the wood, long, deep marks that ran in random directions. I told myself it was probably from moving furniture, but something about them felt off. As I walked through the bedroom, I saw something strange. The closet door had a heavy metal latch on the outside. Not inside, outside. Someone had installed it to keep something in, not out. I tried not to think too much about it. Maybe the previous owner had a dog, and they kept it locked up in there. Or maybe it was for storage. I told myself it didn't matter, but I still didn't open that door. That night, I lit a fire in the fireplace because the cabin was colder than I expected. I made some food, drank a beer, and tried to ignore the unease in my gut. The fire crackled, the wood popping, and for the first time since I arrived, I felt a little better. Then I heard it, a noise from the bedroom, not a creak, not the wind. A noise, a soft, dragging sound, like something sliding against the floor. I froze, listening. It stopped. I told myself it was the house settling, even though it didn't sound like that at all. But I wasn't going to investigate. Instead, I grabbed my bag and brought it out to the living room. I'd sleep on the couch. I lay there for hours, staring at the ceiling, listening. Every small noise made my skin crawl. The fire burned low, the shadows stretching across the walls. I must have fallen asleep at some point, because the next thing I knew, I woke up to complete darkness. The fire had gone out, and the cabin door was open, just slightly, just enough for the cold night air to seep in. I sat up fast, my heart slamming against my ribs. I knew I locked that door. I knew it. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the doorway. Nothing, just the dark outside. The trees stood still, unmoving. No wind.
No sounds.
I got up slowly, every step careful. I reached the door, heart pounding, and shut it. Locked it again. Double-checked, triple-checked. Then I heard the noise again. From the bedroom. That dragging sound. I turned, shining my flashlight toward the hallway. The bedroom door was open. I hadn't left it open. My skin went cold. I wanted to leave, to run, but my keys were in the bedroom. I had to get them. I moved forward slowly, the floor creaking beneath me. My breath felt too loud, like it didn't belong in the silence. The flashlight beam shook as I stepped into the room. The closet door was open. That heavy metal latch had been undone, and the door stood slightly ajar. I didn't look inside. I grabbed my keys from the nightstand and backed out of the room, never turning my back to the closet. My mind was screaming at me to run, but I forced myself to move slow, careful. As soon as I was out of the room, I bolted, grabbed my bag, threw the door open, and sprinted to my car. I didn't look back. I didn't check to see if anything was behind me. I just drove. The road felt longer this time, the trees pressing in. I didn't feel safe until I saw the first streetlight miles away. When I finally stopped at a gas station, my hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold my phone. I called my brother, told him I wasn't staying at the cabin, told him to sell it, burn it, whatever. I wasn't going back. He laughed at first, said I was overreacting. Then I told him about the latch on the closet. The silence on the other end of the line told me everything. He knew. He knew about the latch, about the scratches on the floor. He knew, and he still sent me there alone. I hung up and never spoke to him again. The cabin sold a few months later. Cheap price, no questions asked. But sometimes, late at night, I wonder about the new owner. I wonder if they checked the bedroom closet. I wonder if they locked the door before they went to sleep. I don't know how long I was out there before I finally found the cabin. The sun had just gone down, and the forest had turned into a maze of dark shapes and shifting shadows. My truck had died about 6 miles back on a stretch of road with no signal, and I had no choice but to start walking. I thought I'd reach town, but somewhere along the way, I must have taken a wrong turn. The road was gone. The trees surrounded me on all sides, pressing in tight. Then I saw it. A small, single-story cabin tucked away between thick pine trees. There was no driveway, no lights, no smoke from a chimney, just an old wooden structure standing there in the silence. The door was slightly open, not wide, but cracked just enough to show a sliver of darkness inside. I should have kept walking, but the cold was sinking deep into my bones, and my legs were aching. I told myself it was probably abandoned, that maybe I could rest for a bit, figure out where I was, then leave as soon as the sun came up. I stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of damp wood and something else I couldn't place right away. Something sour. The floor creaked under my weight. I pulled my flashlight from my bag and flicked it on, the beam cutting through the dark. The cabin was small, just one main room with a table, an old wood-burning stove, and a narrow cot against the far wall. There was a single window, but it was covered with heavy curtains, thick with dust. I ran the light across the walls. There were deep scratches in the wood, long and jagged. Not just in one spot, but all over, near the door, along the table, even by the cot. Claw marks, maybe, but too wide, too uneven. I swallowed hard and turned toward the door, ready to leave, but the wind had picked up outside, pushing against the walls, making them groan. I told myself I'd be fine, just for a few hours, just until morning. I slid my bag off my shoulders and sat on the edge of the cot. Felt damp. The smell in the air was stronger here, sticking in my throat. I reached for my flashlight again and shined it down at the mattress. That's when I saw it. A stain, dark brown, nearly black, spreading from the center of the cot outward. Old blood. I shot to my feet. The floor creaked again, but this time, it wasn't just from me. There was another sound, a shift, a rustle. I turned my light toward the table. The old wooden chairs were tucked in, covered in dust. But one of them had moved, just a few inches. I felt the weight of silence pressing down. My own breath sounded too loud. I stepped back toward the door, but something made me stop. A sound, barely there, just under the wind. Breathing, not mine, not from inside the room. Underneath, the floorboards were wide, uneven with gaps between them. I pointed my flashlight down, angling it through the cracks. An eye stared back at me. I didn't scream, couldn't. My body locked up, my lungs turned to stone. The eye didn't blink. It just stared, wide, unblinking, pupils blown wide in the light. A deep, rattling breath rose from below the floor, vibrating through the wood. I moved before my brain could catch up. I grabbed my bag, bolted for the door, and yanked it open so hard it nearly came off the hinges. The cold air hit me like a wall, but I didn't stop. I ran. The trees blurred around me, the wind howling, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly as I tore through the dark. I didn't care where I was going. I just knew I had to get away. I could hear movement behind me, heavy footsteps pounding against the dirt. Fast. Too fast. I ran until my legs burned, until my breath came in ragged gasps. Then, just as I thought I couldn't go any farther, I saw the road, the same narrow stretch where my truck had died hours ago. I stumbled onto the pavement and collapsed to my knees. Silence.
No footsteps. No breathing.
I turned back, gasping, my flashlight shaking in my grip. The woods stood still. No movement, no sound. The cabin was gone. I stared, chest heaving. The trees stood where it should have been, thick and unbroken. No door, no window, just forest. I scrambled to my feet, ran to my truck, and locked myself inside. I didn't sleep. I didn't close my eyes until the first light of dawn stretched across the sky. Then I turned the key, praying, and the engine sputtered to life. I drove until I hit town. I never went back. I never tried to find that road again. But sometimes, late at night, when everything is quiet, I still hear it. The sound of breathing, right beneath me. I don't know how long I've been sitting here. My watch stopped working sometime during the night, and my phone is dead. The fire in the wood stove has burned down to embers, leaving only a dull red glow, the only light inside this godforsaken cabin. I'm afraid to move, afraid to make noise, afraid to breathe too hard. There's something outside, something real, something waiting, and I don't think it's leaving. I came out here for solitude, a break from life. The cabin belongs to my uncle, an old hunting shack deep in the woods, miles from the nearest paved road. No electricity, no running water, just four walls, a roof, and a wood stove. Exactly what I needed, or at least that's what I thought. The first few days were fine. I spent my time chopping wood, fishing in the stream, reading old books by candlelight. The isolation didn't bother me at first. I welcomed it. It was peaceful, the kind of peace you don't get in the city, where there's always traffic noise, sirens, people. Out here, it was just me and the trees, the wind, the distant calls of birds. Then I started noticing things, small things. The first was the door. The cabin door has a thick wooden latch that sticks if you don't lift it just right. One morning, I woke up and found it unlatched. I was sure I'd locked it before going to sleep. Positive. I told myself maybe I hadn't. Maybe I was tired. Maybe I'd been careless. But the thought lingered in my mind all day. That night, I made sure to latch it, double-checked it, even pushed a chair in front of it just to be sure. The next morning, the door was open, wide open. The chair was pushed aside. I didn't sleep that night. I sat up with my hunting knife in my lap, listening. The wind howled through the trees. Branches creaked and groaned. But inside the cabin, everything was still. Nothing happened. The door stayed shut. When the sun finally rose, I told myself I must have dreamed it. A hallucination from isolation, maybe. I was getting in my own head. That had to be it. Then I found the footprints. They were in the dirt just outside the cabin, leading from the tree line to the door and back again. Barefoot, long, thin. Whoever had been outside wasn't wearing shoes. And they hadn't just walked up and left. The prints circled the cabin, again and again, like they were watching, waiting. I should have left right then, packed up, hiked back to my truck, driven home. But I didn't. I told myself it was some drifter passing through, someone looking for shelter. Maybe they got scared off when they saw me inside. Maybe they wouldn't come back. That night, I locked the door again, barred it with the heavy wooden beam my uncle had left leaning against the wall. I moved the chair in front of it again, made sure the windows were latched, then sat in the corner with my knife, waiting, listening. Sometime in the middle of the night, I heard it, a soft scraping sound, like fingernails on wood. It was coming from the door. I held my breath, gripping the knife so tight my knuckles ached. The scraping continued, slow, deliberate, then a pause, then again. Long, slow strokes, as if something was tracing along the wood, feeling it out, testing it. I don't know how long it went on, maybe minutes, maybe hours. I sat there, frozen, barely daring to breathe, and then silence.
No footsteps, no retreating sounds.
Just quiet. I didn't sleep. In the morning, I checked the door.
No scratches, no marks.
But the footprints were there again, fresh in the dirt. More of them this time, closer to the windows. That was 2 nights ago. I haven't slept since. Last night I heard breathing, right outside the window. Heavy, slow, like whoever or whatever. It knew I was inside, knew I was awake, knew I was listening. I don't know what to do. If I leave, I have to go through the woods. Miles of dense trees, with whatever's out there following me, watching me. If I stay, I'm trapped. It's getting bolder. I can feel it. The fire is almost out now. The woodpile inside is low. I'd have to go out to get more, but I can't. I won't. The last time I looked outside, I saw something standing at the tree line, just beyond the reach of the dying fire's glow. Tall, thin, barefoot, watching, waiting. I don't think I'll make it through another night. I should have never come out here alone. The idea had seemed perfect at first. A week in a cabin, deep in the Oregon woods. No phone calls, no emails, no city noise. Just the quiet hum of nature and the crackle of a wood fire. I needed the break. Work had been a nightmare, and I couldn't remember the last time I had slept without waking up in the middle of the night, thinking about deadlines or unfinished reports. The thought of disconnecting completely, even for a few days, felt like the only way I could breathe again. I had rented the cabin from an old man online, who assured me it was stocked with firewood and had everything I needed. The road leading up to it was barely a road at all, just a narrow dirt path that wound through miles of towering pines. My SUV had barely made it up, sliding on the wet ground more than once. When I finally arrived, the place looked just as it had in the pictures. Small, made of dark wood, with a steep roof and a porch that overlooked a quiet lake. The first 2 days were exactly what I had hoped for. I read, I fished a little, I made coffee over a tiny propane stove. The quiet was overwhelming at first, but I adjusted. The only sounds were the rustling trees, the occasional chirp of birds, and the soft lapping of water against the shore. At night, the silence thickened, but the fire kept me company. It was peaceful, until the 3rd night. I had just finished eating and was sitting on the porch, watching the last of the sunlight disappear behind the trees. The air had turned cold, and I was about to go inside when I heard something. Just a soft sound, far off in the woods, a branch snapping. I told myself it was an animal, a deer maybe, but then it came again, closer this time. Another snap, a rustling noise, something moving. I waited, my body tensed, listening. Nothing. After a while, I shook it off and went inside, locking the door behind me. The next day, I hiked a bit, hoping to clear my head. I stayed close to the cabin, never letting it out of sight. I didn't want to admit it, but something about last night had unsettled me. The feeling lingered, even in the daylight. That night, it happened again. This time, there was no mistaking it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, someone walking through the trees. I held my breath, straining to hear. They stopped. I waited, heart pounding. Minutes passed. Nothing. And then a thud against the cabin wall. Not a knock. Not an animal. Something solid. A deliberate sound. I grabbed the flashlight and stood by the window, staring out into the darkness. The beam of light cut through the trees, but I saw nothing. The night was thick shadows, too dark to make anything out. But I could feel it. Someone was out there. I barely slept. Every sound made me flinch. Every creak of the old cabin felt like something approaching. Morning couldn't come fast enough. By the 5th day, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I packed my things quickly, stuffing them into my bag. But when I got to my SUV, my stomach dropped. The tires were slashed. All 4 of them, deep gashes running across the rubber. I stood there for a long time, the silence pressing in. Someone had done this. Someone had been close enough to my cabin, close enough to my car, and I had never heard them. Panic surged in my chest. The nearest town was over 30 miles away. No cell service. No way to call for help. I forced myself to breathe. I wasn't going to sit here and wait for whoever had done this to come back. I grabbed my pack, took a knife from the kitchen, and started walking. The road was empty, just an endless stretch of dirt cutting through the trees. I walked fast, forcing my feet to keep moving, my ears straining for any sound. A mile in, I heard it. Behind me, the sound of footsteps moving through the trees. I stopped. So did they. A cold sweat broke out on my skin. I turned slowly, scanning the woods. Nothing. But I knew someone was there, watching, following. I didn't run. I wanted to, but I knew better. Running meant panic. Running meant making noise. I kept moving, steady, controlled. Another mile. The sun was dipping lower. I needed to move faster. Then, ahead of me, in the middle of the road, something that made my blood turn to ice. A single boot print. Fresh. Not mine. I turned, heart hammering, and that's when I saw him. A man standing between the trees. Just standing. Watching. He didn't move, didn't say a word. I ran. I don't remember thinking. I just ran. My pack slammed against my back. My legs burned, but I didn't stop. I could hear him behind me, crashing through the underbrush, keeping pace. The road curved, and I saw something ahead, a car, parked on the side of the road. A hunter, maybe, someone, anyone. I ran faster, waving my arms, shouting. The man behind me was close, too close. The driver stepped out. An older man, bearded, wearing a thick jacket. He looked at me, then past me. His face changed. He reached into his truck, pulled something out. A shotgun. The man chasing me stopped. Just like that, he turned, melted back into the woods without a word. I collapsed, gasping for breath. The old man helped me into his truck, locked the doors. He didn't ask questions, didn't say much at all. He just drove me out of there, back to town. The police checked the cabin later. They found my SUV, my slashed tires. They found footprints, lots of them. but no sign of the man, no sign of anyone. They told me I was lucky. I already knew that,